All right, Shabbos, good morning, good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's shir. To thank our TALMUD Torah sponsors for the month of Nisan, Paul and Kathy Pollack, for dedicating all of Shurim this month in memory of Paul's parents, Shmuel ben Zechariah and Sarah bas Avraham. And to thank Avraham and Shaindy Kelman for dedicating the Shurim this month in memory of Sarah, Bryna, bas Yehoshua, Heschel. To thank our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Andrea Lavine, on the occasion of the 30th Yahrzeit of Basha, Leah, bas Lippa. And to thank Mark and Elsa Lustman for dedicating this year today in creation of the Yahrzeit of Dr. Lustman's father, Jacob Lustman. Zechariah the Bracha, we hope that the merit of our Talmud Torah, the neshama will have an aliyah, and the family's a neshama. All right, Basha, with that, let us begin. Exciting times ahead of us today. The second to last daf in Meseches Nazir. And it is a good one. So we'll say, so today's daf is Samech 65. We are picking up in Yerzeit Hashem on Samech Daled Amud Days 64b. 64b, 4 lines up from the bottom. Hamotzi Meis Betchila Mushka V'Kidarko. So we'll say, so here's the interesting case over here. A person goes out and finds a grave. He stumbles upon a grave. Now we'll say, if you look at Tosis, the Mishnah uses lashon of betchila. Betchila means in the beginning. What does that mean? So Tosis, if you look at Samach Talam, it's the right hand side of the page. Betchila shelo nodalo ki kavar sham bekever. We're talking about a situation where you did not know that there was a kever there. Right? So a person didn't know that there was a grave. So literally, again, he stumbles upon a grave. Unearths a grave. Okay. I will say now, watch this. Mushkav kidarko, and the corpse itself is arranged normally. Kidarko means, I will say, we'll discuss this. That the Gemara discusses that still to this day we bury bodies in a certain way, right? We go ahead and we bury bodies ultimately again laying down flat, right? Hands crossed, eyes closed, hands crossed over the chest or stomach area, right? There's a certain way. Again, in terms of that, contemporarily, it's actually interesting. Different Chaver Kadishas do things different ways, but for our purposes, it means laying flat. And we'll see some even greater details in just a little bit. The point is, you stumble upon a grave, and it's a quote-unquote legitimate grave. Then I will say, what's the halacha? Note low. So now you want to move the grave. Right? So you're allowed to move the grave. Now I will say, here's what's interesting. Why are you allowed to move the grave? So just keep that in mind. We're going to see a rush at the end of this Mishnah, which is going to help shed a lot of light on this particular issue. So note low, that's tefusasa. So I'll say, you can move the grave, but if you move the grave, you also have to go ahead and move the tefusa. Now, so we've actually seen this before. What's the tefusa? Tefusa means all the loose earth around the body, plus some additional, we'll call it, virgin soil around it. We'll discuss exactly what that is in the Gemara. So I'll say, I'll just point out to you, first of all, if you look, and I apologize for this, the rush for this Mishnah is on Samechei Amud Aleph, 65a. So if you don't mind, I'm sorry, I know it's inconvenient, but you'll just take a quick look at the rush on Samechei because it's important to see it together with the Mishnah. He says, no tluas tefusaso. He says, mutter lifnosa misham. So both say, the first thing the Mishnah is teaching you over here is you're allowed to move the body. This is very important. We'll see why exactly you're allowed to move the body. But you're allowed to move the body, and to bury it somewhere else. So we'll see exactly the amount of dirt that you have to go ahead and take with you. We'll say, the chiddush over here is, you find an intentionally buried body, you are allowed to move the grave. Why? We'll see. You're allowed to move the grave. Right? Number 2, if you do move the grave, you have to move it along with the surrounding dirt. Fine. Back to Mishnah. Back to Samach Talam base. That's case 1. I will say now what happens. Shnayim. Similar again, if you find 2 bodies buried, right? Now I will say same case. So as you're finding 2 bodies buried within close proximity to each other, you same halacha. Notlin, that's tefusasan. You're allowed to. So I will say there's 2 halachas over here, right? Number 1. What's halacha number 1? Halacha number 1. You can move the body. Halacha number 2 is that when you move the body, you have to move the tefusa, the loose earth, along with it. Same thing with 2 bodies. Masa shlosha. Okay. Now you find 3 bodies. And both say, and now it's all confirming to the same thing. You find 3 bodies that are what we call buried kidarko, right? Mushkav kidarko. They're buried in the normal way, quote unquote normal way. Right? So now you find 3 bodies. So both say, so now watch this. So we'll say if between body number 1 and body number 3, right? So again, the 2 bookend bodies, there is no less than Dalet Amos and no more than 8 Amos, Hare ze shchunas kivaras. We'll say what you've stumbled upon is a burial chamber. What you've stumbled upon is a burial chamber. Because we'll say, or essentially 3 bodies within a certain amount of space, right? All mushkov, all laying in the same way. We'll say we're going to see, by the way, it's also that the direction of the bodies have to be the same, right? So they're all, let's say, all aligned, what's the right word, right? All head and feet facing in the same direction. So, right, all head and feet facing in the same direction, right? Buried or clearly arranged, like the bodies were placed there intentionally, right? And ultimately, again, no less than 4 amos and no more than 8 amos between the distance of body 1 and body 3, you've stumbled upon a burial chamber. Now, I will say, what's the ramification of stumbling upon a burial chamber? So once again, take a look at the Rush. Now, actually, the truth is, now you could go ahead, turn to Daf Samachay. Now, I will say you could look at the Rush. It's clear that those bodies were intentionally placed there for burial. And you cannot move the bodies. And I will say, this is a very important Rush. Now watch this. He says, and I will say, in general, even when you find one body, if you know that the body was intentionally, permanently buried there, you cannot move it. So what's the svara of the earlier part of the Mishnah? Right? Why does the Mishnah say in the beginning that if you discover a body, one body, or even 2 bodies, you're allowed to move them? Shabbos, I said the Rush explains over here. He says, "Ella shebe'echad obeis anutolin shelo nikbaru sham ella lefi shah v'hayadaitam lifnosam o nikbaru b'sadav v'lo rishus habaylim v'lo kano mekomam." Shabbos, listen to this. Now the Rush sheds light on this. When a person accidentally unearths one body or 2 bodies, we'll say, what do we assume happened over here? What's the narrative we're constructing? The narrative we're constructing is that what happened? Someone died here. Person didn't have the person who found the body didn't have time to move the body to a proper burial place. So what did they do? They buried here. They buried here with what intention? To move the body at a later time. So therefore, I will say, when we discover this body, we assume that essentially what? This is a temporary burial. And therefore, Allah Alamaisa, because it's a temporary burial, therefore what? When you discover these bodies, you are allowed to move them. Because we assume that's the narrative we construct. Well, so remember again, I just want to point out over here, where are you discovering these graves? You're putting on addition to your house, or whatever, whatever you're doing. And the point over here is you unearth graves in a place where there was no expectation that there were graves. So therefore the narrative is someone died here, was temporarily buried here, and therefore because it was temporary, you have the right to relocate the grave. Of course, they're going to say what ends up happening. Once you discover 3 graves, right, and the bodies are all arranged in the same way, and there's a certain distance, minimum and maximum distance between the bodies, and I will say, then what? Then what do I realize? This is not a temporary grave, this is a burial chamber. Okay, so once it's a permanent grave, I will say, you are not allowed to move the bodies. I will say, this is very important, because even contemporarily, the minhag is that when we bury someone passed away, we bury someone, today, when you bury a loved one in Chutz La'aretz, we always bury with a t'nai, with a condition. What's the condition? That if you want to move the grave to Eretz Yisrael at some point in time, then Allah Alamaisi, you reserve the right to do so. When we bury with a t'nai, that makes it essentially a temporary grave. So again, I always tell these people, even if a person has no intention, let's say a person has a family plot, right? So you have multiple generations of the family buried. So let's say your intention is not to move the grave to Eretz Yisrael, but still we always bury with the Tanai, in case you want to be able to move the grave. Fine. So I'll say, so now, in case I will say, case number one is I discovered one body, no problem. So I'll say, now we understand two halachas. What's halacha number one? Halacha number one, you're allowed to move it. Why are you allowed to move it? It's a temporary grave. But when you do move it, what do you have to do? You have to take the loose soil. That's right. That's case one. Case two is same thing with two bodies. Case three, you find three bodies. Again, I will say, but it's not just finding three bodies. It's finding three bodies organized in a certain way. Burial chamber. Once it's a burial chamber, so number one, you can't move the bodies because it's a permanent burial. Number two, I will say top of Samachay. Furthermore, I will say the way burial chambers were often arranged was sometimes you had multiple burial chambers kind of arranged side by side. So he says, therefore, Bodei Kemenu Ulahalon Esrim Amma. So what you have to do now is you have to check 20 amas, right, from that grave for the possibility of any other grave. So in other words, once you've discovered a burial chamber, you have to take into account that maybe there are other burial chambers in the area, and therefore Allah L'maisa 20 amas you have to check. So we'll say, so if indeed you find another grave 20 amas away from the ones you discovered, then we'll say, what do you have to do? So we'll say, essentially, you have to keep checking 20 amas from any grave you find. So in other words, just to play this out, so if you discover 3 graves, burial chamber, you move 20 amas, you find another grave, okay, then what? We'll say that the discovery of that grave requires you to what? Check another 20 amas. Fine. Why? The Gemara says, Shrakalaim Ladavar. Ultimately, because there's Rakaim Ladavar. In other words, there's circumstantial proof that something's going on over here. She'ilu tchila matzo, not lo ve'estefusaso. That was actually an interesting statement. The Mishnah just says, by the way, because remember, going kind of looping back, if you were just to find one body, you'd be able to move that body as well as the surrounding dirt. Good. I'll say, so this is the halacha. So let's analyze this. So Amar Rav Yehuda. So we'll say, we're focusing now on the first halachas, the first 2 cases where you're discovering one body or you're discovering 2 bodies. We assume that in this kind of case, these were bodies that were temporarily buried in place. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, A, you have the right to move the grave. Number 2, you must take the surrounding soil along with it. So now watch this. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Yehuda, matzah. Now we'll say, when we say, remember, the lashon of the Mishnah is hamotzi. You're finding a mace. So prat l'matzoi. So we'll say, so obviously, this comes to exclude what? A known grave. Right? So in other words, if people know that someone, we're talking about a case, we'll say the whole chap of this case is, how are you finding the grave? Accident. Right? By accident, you stumbled upon it. So we'll say, because no one knew about it, that allows us to create the narrative that somebody was probably just buried here in haste, but this is a temporary, non-permanent grave. Right? Masha'inki. If you were to go ahead and what? If you were to go ahead and ultimately, again, know about this grave, so then I will say, people know about it, you can't really claim that it's a temporary grave. So, prat lamatzoi, mace. So I'll say, what does it mean that a person's dead? That's usually the people you find in a grave. So I'll say, so why does it have to say, in other words, we'll say a little bit repetitive, hamotzi, mace. You find the dead person in a grave. Okay, good thing, right? So I say, right, why does it have to say mace? To which the Gemara says, very interesting, prat laharog. I both say this comes to exclude finding someone who was murdered. In other words, mace means someone who died of natural causes, versus harog means someone who was killed. Then I both say, wherein lies the distinction? So if you take a look, it's very interesting. I both say, he says over here, mace in the second wide line, for me, a second wide line of the rush, he says, prat laharog, he says over here, okay, Rashi has his own approach, but the Rashi says over here, prat laharog she'ein lo tefusa v'lo shchuna mishum tekechas dami v'hachi gemiri. I will say, these halachos of tefusa, taking the earth around the corpse, only apply to a person who died naturally. It doesn't apply to a person who was killed. And same halacha of finding a burial chamber also doesn't apply to finding someone who was killed. So in other words, I will say, if you find the body, and there are signs that this person did not die of natural causes, but rather, again, this person was killed. Again, they will say there are some, it's decapitated, right? Or other things like that. So Lamaisa, again, the Gemara is pointing out, these halachos that we put down in the Mishnah do not apply to such a body. There's no din of tfusa, and there's no din of shchunas kvaras, burial chamber. Okay, next, mushkav. So remember again, the Mishnah said you find the body lying down. Prat liyoshev. Ultimately, I will say this comes to exclude a body that you find sitting. I was about to say, imagine for a moment you unearth a grave, but the position of the body is in a sitting position. So these halachos don't apply. Now, both say, why don't these halachos apply? So interestingly enough, here we're going to see. Actually, let's finish up. He says, prat liyoshev, kidarko. You find the body arranged in the normal way. Prat l'sharosho munach ben yerei kosav. I will say, as opposed to finding a body that's in the fetal position. Finding a body in the fetal position. And I will say, now, I don't understand, why don't these halachos apply if you find the body in a sitting or fetal position? So once again, if you look at the Rush says over here, the Dilma of de kochavim ninhu kevan delo nikbaru bid kidin. I will say, if you find the body in a sitting position or a fetal position, it's probably not a Jew. Because Jews don't bury this way. Well, so remember again, so we're finding a body. The point that the Gemara is trying to make over here is all of these halachos, concerning tefusa, taking the loose earth, as well as going ahead and additional soil, as well as going ahead and potentially if you find 3, it's a burial chamber. This only applies to Jews. So the point is, if you find the body physically arranged in a non-normative fashion, i.e., the body is sitting in place, or for that matter, again, the body's in the fetal position, chances are this person is not Jewish. And therefore, obviously, all of these halachas are not going to apply. Fine. So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, Tani Ula Bar Chanina, Meis Shechaser. It will say, if you find the body and the body is deficient, Shechaser also means it's missing a limb, or again, it's clear the person was killed, and therefore there's part of the body that's deficient. Eino tfusa ve'ein velo shchunas kvaras. So we'll say, so again, the halacha of tfusa does not apply to this body, nor does the halacha ultimately, again, of shchunas kvaras, of a burial chamber, apply to this body. Again, I will say, it's just the halacha. The chol hani my taima. So we'll say, why is that? Now, this is specifically going back on if you find the body in a sitting position or in a fetal position. Why do the halachos that the Mishnah espoused not apply to this body? To which the Gemara says, Dilma oved kochavimhu. Once again, because since the body is buried in a way that doesn't really seem to mirror Jewish practice, there's a concern that this is not a Jew, that this is a non-Jew, and therefore halacha lamaisa, it's not a problem. Matzah shnayim, so also listen to this. What happens if you go ahead and you find 2 bodies? Matzah shnayim, Rosh Shalzeh, B'tzad Margalos of Shalzeh. So we'll say, I alluded to this in the Mishnah. You find 2 bodies, but again we'll say the bodies are aligned head to foot. So we'll say, what's the halacha? So Matzah Shnayim, Rosh Shalzeh, B'tzad Margalos of Shalzeh. Right? Rosh Shalzeh, B'tzad Margalos of Shalzeh. Ein lahen tfusa, v'lo shchunas kvaras. So we'll say, there's no din of tfusa. And we'll say, so again, I just want to point out over here, what you begin to see is that halacha l'maisa, the din of tfusa is only a din in Jews. The din of shchunas kvaras is only a din in Jews, right? So in other words, you only have to remove the loose soil when you're finding Jewish bodies. You only have to go ahead and be choshesh for a burial chamber when you're dealing with Jews. So therefore, halacha l'maisa, yeah.
What about a Jew who had a leg amputated, like for a disease?
It's still chaser. Yeah, that'd be the halacha. Now again, remember, this is a specific area. Obviously, if you know it's a Jew, so you treat that carefully with Kedushas Yisrael. If the person is buried permanently, again, you can't move the grave. They're just talking about something very specific over here in terms of buried. Remember, and these are discovered graves. So this is a very specific case where I never knew that anyone was buried over here. I'm discovering this grave. Remember, often what that also means is you don't know who this person is. So remember also, so you have to reconstruct an entire narrative around this situation. So I don't know who the person is. I never knew there was a grave here. Say, I assume it was temporary, right? B, if it's only one, there's no shkunas kavara. So that's where these halachos are applying. So I will say. So listen to this. So now, in this case over here, you're finding two bodies, right? And halacha l'maisa, they're buried head to foot. Right? So what's the halacha? So number one, there's no tfusa. Number two, there's no din of burial chamber. Now, both say obviously, I'm only talking about two. To never create a burial chamber. He's even saying that what? Even if you were to find three bodies buried like this, it's still not a burial chamber because this is not how Jews bury. Okay, next. Matzah shlosha. So we'll say, listen to this. Let's say you end up finding three bodies. But here's what's interesting. Ha'echad yadua u'shnayim tchila. Now we'll say in this case, one of the graves you were aware of. Two of them you just discovered. So I'll say, so now I'm finding a total of three graves. One of them I knew about, that's what it means. Echad yadua, one of them was known. Shnayim tchila. Two of them were just discovered. Oh, I will say now here the wording just becomes a little bit confusing. The Mizrahi Sashash changes this. He says over here, oh echad, the way the Mizrahi Sashash reads it, oh echad tchila, one of them was just discovered. Ushnayim yaduim. And two of them were known before. So let's say it's the same case. In other words, it's just the reverse. In other words, I find three bodies. Let's say one of them was known about, two of them were discovered. Or vice versa. Two of them were known about, and one of them was discovered. So we'll say, what's the halacha in this case? Once again, the Mizrahi Sashas changes this over here. Yesh lahem tfusa. They have a din of tfusa. Ve'ein lahem shchunas kvaros. But they have no din of a burial chamber. Now we'll say, now here's what's interesting about this. Now, they have tfusa. Why do they have tfusa? Because remember again, I will say, the halacha of tfusa applies to what? Any Jewish body. Right? That's the halacha of tfusa. So in other words, that's not dependent on number, that's just dependent on assuming that this is a Jew. Which I will say, we assume it's a Jewish body as long as what? It's buried in the normal fashion, right? In other words, that we have no. That will say. What I do want to point out is, remember, there also has to be some level. With Pasha, there has to be like some level of circumstantial evidence as well. In other words, let's say if you go downtown, right, and find a body buried in a field, right. I guess that's not such a crazy case, right? Right? But Lamaisa again. So you wouldn't dafka assume that that's a Jew. Obviously, there has to be also greater circumstantial evidence over here that this is a Yid, right? It's in a Jewish neighborhood. It's on Jewish-owned property. Things like that. But Lamaisa again, the point over so tfusa is a din that applies anytime that you have a Jewish body. Now I will say, listen to this, but there's no din of a burial chamber. Now why? Apparently, I will say, the way a burial chamber works is either you know about all of them or you know about none of them. Right? So I will say, it's interesting. In other words, because if it was a real burial chamber, then it should have been known. And Lamaisa, again, so either you know about it or you don't know about it. Apparently, partial knowledge takes away from the ability ultimately for this to be declared as a burial chamber. Very interesting. All right, there's a lot of. If you take a look at the Rush says over here, "Ve'ein lahem shchuna, v'yachol lifnosa misham, kevan shelo hayu shloshtan me'inyan echad, ein tolen shenikbaru sham l'shem kever." So Rabbi say, now listen to this. Now, by the way, Rabbi say, I just want to point out what's the ramification of not being a burial chamber? What's the ramification? You can move the bodies. Right, that's the big thing. Remember again, once you become an established burial chamber, then this is a permanent grave. You can't move the body. So by saying that ultimately, again, it's not a burial chamber, ultimately, again, you can move the body. The Rosh explains that why is this. He says that Allah Lamaisa, he says, Shem Shalom Shem Kever, Shainim Su Beis, Shainim Yiduim, V'chem Beis, Aval Kisha Shloshtan Yiduim. So this is exactly what he said before. That Allah Lamaisa, again, with a burial chamber, either all of them have to be known at the beginning, or none of them were known. So if none of them were known, that means tells us there was a burial chamber here. We forgot about it. Now it becomes known. But partial knowledge ultimately erodes the ability to declare this as a burial chamber. Incredible. But let's listen to this. There was a story of Rabbi Yishavev. And what happened? About say he discovered ultimately again two known graves. I should say. There were two known graves, and he discovered a third. Ubikesh la sosan shchunas kvaros. And Rabbi Shabbai was ready to declare this as a burial chamber. After all, again, now 3 bodies. We'll say again, they must have aligned, right? They were all buried in the same way, right? With a maximum of, or with a minimum of 4 amas, maximum of 8 amas between bodies 1 and 3. And Rabbi Shammai was ready to declare this as a burial chamber. Amar Rabbi Akiva says, Kol shiagata lirik yagata. Rabbi Akiva said, all of your effort has been in vain. Has been in vain. Why? Lo amru shunas kvaris ela legimel yeduin ol shlosha tchila. Because we'll say the halacha as Chazal structured it is, something can only be called the shunas kvaris, the burial chamber, if what? If either all 3 were known from the beginning or all 3 were discovered. Again, Rabbi Akiva is just saying that is just the partial, that is just the way that Chazal established. We'll say there's not a svara. I mean, there is a svara. We're going to discuss svara in just a little bit, but ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa, that's the halacha structure. I just point out to you, I found it very striking the way Rabbi Akiva responded to Rabbi Yeshavev. Right, so I guess remember again, what's the case? Rabbi Yeshavev, right, there was a known grave, or what was the case? There were 2 known graves, and he discovered another one. So, right, Rabbi Shavev says, great, burial chamber. And Rabbi Akiva says, Rabbi Shavev, everything you did, kol sheyagata, larik yagata, was for naught. I would say, it's such a dramatic, and generally, this happens all the time, where someone does something they're wrong. So generally, again, what does the opposing rabbinic view say to them? You're wrong. No, it's such a dramatic answer. Kol sheyagata, larik yagata. All of the effort you expended was for us. So we'll say, what's the pshat? Why such a dramatic response to such a seemingly undramatic event? We'll say, so I think what Rabbi Akiva was trying to teach Rabbi Shammai was as follows. So there are certain things in life that are true, even if you don't understand it. Right? They're fact. They're fact. Whether you know it, you don't know, you understand, you don't. It's fact. So we'll say, sometimes in life there are facts that don't make sense to us. And so we spend a lot of time trying to go ahead and work around those facts, undermine those facts, or go ahead and refute those facts. And we'll say, what is that? What do we call that? That's called an exercise in futility. That sometimes in life there are truths that you have to accept, even if you don't like them. What Rabbi Akiva, I think, is saying over here to Rabbi Shavev, I understand what your svara, but there's a fact over here. What's the fact? The fact is that the definition of a shchunas kvaris is either 3 known graves or 3 unknown graves. Rabbi Yeshavev, don't spend your life knocking your head against facts which are undeniably true, even if you don't understand them, or even if you don't particularly subscribe to them. I would say it's such an incredible use, because the general greater principle is that in life there are certain immutable realities. You could spend your life lamenting those realities, complaining about those realities, but as Rabbi Akiva says, Kol sheyagata, larik yagata. That's wasted effort. That's wasted time. Life is all about accepting the facts. Life is all about accepting those immutable realities. I will say in life there are many things you can change, and there are a number of significant things that you can't. And you see this ma'aseh b'kol yom. People spend so much time trying to change and lamenting the things that they can't, or lament that they can change, instead of focusing those efforts on the areas that I can impact change. And Rabbi Akiva, I think, is trying to teach this lesson. This is a fact. This is an immutable reality. This is what it is. So stop it. Stop it. Go ahead and just use your kochos. In this case, use your intellectual prowess to focus on areas in life where you can impact change. Rabbi says, such a musar haskell. We spend so much time complaining, lamenting, I wish life was like this should have been like this, I should have been like this, my kid should have been like this, my marriage should have been like this, all the things that should have, could have. Okay, it is, this is what you got right now. Work with what you got, impact change where you can, and don't go ahead and squander your koach, lamenting and trying to things that are immutable realities of life. Kol sheyagata, larik yagata. I will say is unfortunately a statement that has so many of us spend our days and spend our lives. Incredible. Let's go weiter. Not invest tfusa and hechida mit tfusa. So we'll say, what's tfusa? How much is tfusa? I'm Rabbi Yehuda Markrab. Let's listen to this. V'nasasi mimitzrayim. So remember, Yaakov says it's very interesting. Where is this pasuk? This pasuk is by Yaakov Avinu, right? So Yaakov Avinu says, when I die, v'nasasi mimitzrayim, take me from Egypt and bury me in Eretz Yisrael. So we'll say, This is an incredible drasha. V'nasasi mimitzrayim tol imi. What Yaakov Avinu was saying to his children was, bring with me from Mitzrayim. In other words, what the Gemara is dashing over here is when you're buried in the soil and that grave is going to be relocated, then what? You have to take of that soil in which you were buried with you. Now, what's incredibly unique about this drasha? Incredibly unique. Yaakov Avinu was never buried in the soil of Mitzrayim, which is just interesting. In other words, I will say, the drasha is like this. Yaakov Avinu sounds like what the Gemara is saying is kind of assumed that it may take a little bit of time for him to be buried in Eretz Yisrael. Well, we see by the way, this is what happened with Yosef, right? Yosef was first buried in Egypt, and then when Klal Yisrael left 210 years later, we took the remains of Yosef as well as the remains of all the other Shvatim with us to Eretz Yisrael. So it sounds like what the Gemara is saying is Yaakov Avinu assumed that the same thing was going to happen to him as well. So what happens? Onesasani mimitzrayim. The drasha over here, I don't know what Yaakov Avinu thought, what he didn't think, but at least the drasha over here is, Yaakov Avinu is saying, take with me from the soil of Egypt. In other words, that if I'm buried in the soil here first, and you move my grave, take from the soil with me. I'll say that's the tfusa. Fine. Totally me, the kamashir, but I'll say, how kamashir tfusa? How much is tfusa? Perush Abelazar, no tel afar tichuach. You take any loose soil around the body. The chofer bebesula gimel etzbaos. I will say, as well as 3 finger breadths of dirt. So I will say, so it's any loose soil, and then we'll call it in the harder, like virgin soil around it, 3 finger breadths of soil. So the Gemara says, the Gemara is meisvei, the Gemara is a kasha, the kamashir tfusa. So the Gemara says, the Bryna says, how much is the shir tfusa? Perush Abelazar Rabbi Sadok, no telas hakismin, ves hakisasa. So we'll say, kismin, the Rush says again, are the wood chips. I will say now, what are the wood chips? The wood chips of Pashas are from the decomposed casket. You take the wood chips and the kisasos. So I will say, ultimately, kisasos are the clumps of earth. And I will say, why do you have clumps of earth? The assumption is the clumps of earth are a result of the bodily secretions that caused the dirt around the body to clump up. So you have to take the wood chips, that's the decomposed casket. You have to take the clumps of earth. V'zorek es havadoin. And we'll say, if you know that there are parts of dirt that are totally not part of the corpse, you can throw them away. Umaniach es hasvekos. But you have to take anything that might be part of the body. V'ashar mitztaref l'rov binyono, shalmeis, u'l'rova atzamos. L'malei tarvad rakev. So we'll say, and everything else combines, ultimately again to form the majority of the skeletal frame. Aruba, right, a quarter calf of bones, and malei tavarekar. Let's say you thought we were done, but we were not, right? And a ladle full of corpse dust. We're making a cameo appearance over here on Staff Samechei. So we'll say, so here's the problem. It's a stira. We just said, what's the definition of tfusa? What's the definition of tfusa? Any loose dirt and 3 finger breadths of virgin soil. We'll say, over here, what's the definition of tfusa? Sounds like, again, the wood chips, clouds of earth, and any suffix amount. So what's going on over here? So Huda Amar Kiyai Tana. Ultimately, again, Rabbi Yehuda says like the following Tana: the sign of a kamashir tfusa. What is the shir tfusa? Rabbi Yochanan Shor ben Azai. No tel afar tichuach. You take the loose dirt. The chofer kibetchila shalosh atzba bebesula shalosh atzbaos, and you take 3 finger breadths of virgin soil. So we'll say Paskins like that opinion. We'll say now halach l'mais. That's how the Gemara Paskins that the definition of tfusa ultimately again is loose dirt together with 3 finger breadths of soil. Incredible. I will say the last line, Bode Kemenu. So remember again, I will say this is talking about over here if halacha l'maisa. If halacha l'maisa, you do go ahead and what? You do go ahead and find 3 graves. So you have to go ahead and halacha l'maisa again, check 20 amas. Bode Kemenu. We'll say Amud Beis. So Amar Rabba. Badak upana. So I'll say, this is actually a very interesting case. Okay, here we go. So we'll say, now here's the case. You find the grave, right? Right? Upana. We'll say, upana means you move it. Okay, so it's just a regular day. What's the Wednesday? Regular Wednesday. Today's Wednesday. Right, regular Wednesday. Right? You find the grave. Okay, so what do? You find the grave. You move it. Now we'll say, now you're asking yourself, why are you moving it? Right? Because it's your backyard. That's why you're moving it, right? In other words, that's kind of the case we're talking about over here. Right? In other words, again, the previous owner told me that there are many buried treasures over here in the house. Little did I know that it wasn't a metaphor. Right? So the Maisa again, I find the grave. So now I move it. Fine. No, totally mutter. So Bada Kupana, right? So Bada Kupana. So I was like, fine. This happens with body number 2. I will say, happens with body number 1, happens with body number 2. I will say, guess what? Badak va'ashkach. So I will say, see now what happens? Now I find a third body. Right? I find a third body. So I will say, so now what do I do? So Rava says, Lo hai mifni le gabi. Lo hai mifni le gabi hanach trei. So I will say, I can't move this third body. Bless you. I can move this third body. We'll say, now, why can't I move this third body? Why not? Because we'll say, now, essentially, what do I realize ex post facto? This burial chamber. So I can't move the third body to the other 2. V'lo hani trei legabe haichad. Nor do I move the other 2 bodies back over here. Now, we'll say, take a look at the Rush. Lo hai mipnei gabe hanach. Ein yachal lifnos hagimol mikan. So we'll say, so therefore, I can't go ahead and move the third body, because now it turns out that Lamaisa again, there is a burial chamber over here. There wasn't not only that, but I also can't move the 2 other bodies back. Why not? Rosh says, I will say, now listen to this. I also don't have to move the other 2 bodies back. Now, why don't I have to move the other 2 bodies back? Why not? Very simple. Because we'll say, I didn't do anything wrong. L'maisa, when I discovered those first 2 bodies, I just saw them as individual bodies. So therefore, again, I will say, here's interesting. So Rava says, you can't move body number 3 because it turns out you've stumbled upon a burial chamber, but you're also not obligated to move back the previous 2 bodies as well. So we'll say alternate version. Another version of Rava. Lifnos mefana lahom. So we'll say, listen to this. We'll say in this alternate version of Rava, this is incredible, which is what? Halacha l'maisa will say, I could go ahead and move all of them. In this alternate version of Rava even gives you permission to move body number 3. Why, Rabbi say? Why? Because essentially, what do? Rabbi say? We look at each of these events as independent events. So I found body number 1 event. The event is over. Body number 2, event is over. Now, so when I find body number 3, that is a self-standing, independent event. And therefore, the alternate version of Rava is, I am allowed to move body number 3 as well. Incredible. So the Gemara says, So, but 1 second, I will say, I understand how, in this alternate version, I will say, I found 3 bodies. Right? In other words, I will say, and assuming by the way, that halacha l'maisa, obviously these bodies are conforming to the other details. In other words, right, they're all buried in the same direction, they're buried in the appropriate way, there's a minimum of 4 amas, maximum of 8 amas between bodies 1 and number 3. So essentially what the Gemara says over here is asking, I don't understand, at the end of the day, B'pashtus, you stumbled upon a burial chamber. So how can you ignore that? Amrei Shlakish, Yar Ila, Matzu, the Tir Eretz Yisrael. The Chazal found an excuse, and they purified Eretz Yisrael. Which I will say means what? In other words, I will say, so remember, we have a vested interest in not having unmarked burial chambers or unmarked graves. Sefer I will say, essentially, when we could use some type of pretext in order to preserve the purity of Eretz Yisrael, we do so. So therefore, I will say, essentially, what the Ila means an excuse. If you take a look at the Rush says over here, Amrei Shlakish, Ila Matzu, Ba'alila Mu'etes, the Svara Kitana, Tiaru Eretz Yisrael, right? So I will say with a small excuse, we're Metayar Eretz Yisrael, Mishum Kohanim, Va'osim Taros. Va'achinam Mikevin Sheber So I will say, so essentially, what the Gemara says is like this. Since this guy moved the graves Veheter, and when he moved them, ultimately, again, there was no reason for him to assume that there was a burial chamber there. Essentially, I will say, it's an excuse for us to keep the Tara level, or the Tara, not level, what's the term I'm looking for? The Tara, status, thank you. Status of this area. Good. It's an excuse to maintain Tara. Beautiful. So I will say, listen to this. I was saying, very, very profound idea. Sometimes if you want to go ahead and maintain Tara, don't look too closely. This in general is good, especially for relationships. Right? In other words, don't put other people under the microscope. Don't put other people under the microscope, because if you put anyone under the microscope, including yourself, you're going to find all types of defects. Sometimes it's just good to look from a distance. Right? So let me say again, I'm not looking at 3 bodies. Instead, what am I looking at? 3 individual occurrences of one body, right? A body A, body B, body C. I'm looking at them as independent occurrences, and ultimately it's an excuse just to maintain a Tara of Eretz Yisrael. Right? Again, sometimes look at people from a distance. Right? Don't look at people as a conglomerate of all of their mistakes. A wonderful way to maintain healthy balance and good life relationships. Badak me'esrim ama v'lo matzamai. So I'll say, so now, interestingly enough, if you go ahead and you just remember, we saw before that once you find the Shunas Kvaras, a burial chamber, you have to go ahead and go out 20 amas to try to see if there's another grave. So Badak me'esrim ama v'lo matzamai. So we'll say, what happens if you went in and you went 20 amas and you didn't find anything? So Avraham Menashe Bar Yirmiyah Amarav Shunas Kvaras. Ultimately, again, what he says, all it is, ultimately, again, you found a burial chamber. If you look at the Rush, Shchunas Kvaras, Ein Latame Elagima Harishonim Shematza Veitzarch Lidokod. And I was going to say, once you check out a distance of 20 amas and there's nothing there, then we assume ultimately again that the burial chamber is contained or is limited to the 3 bodies that you found. Good, I will say the Rush erases that last line. Let's go back to the couple of minutes that we have left. So we'll say, by the way, fascinating sugya, absolutely fascinating sugya. Kol safek nigoim betchila tar achol niskak l'tumah. Misheniskak l'tumah svegotame. So we'll say now a very, very interesting case as well over here. So we'll say, if you have a case of safek nigoim, now we'll say, now what's the case? We'll say, can I just read you that last Rush? By the way, I just want to point out, we are totally not behind. We're absolutely on schedule. We'll say, because if you look, I know I'm seeing some nervous twitches, Daf Yomi twitches happening over here. Let's see, we are going to finish the Masechta tomorrow, because if you look, Samech Vav Amud Beis is a very, very short Amud. So we'll say we were right where we need to be. It's all pre-planned from the beginning of the Masechta. It's part of my master plan, right? You'll look at my notes. This is where I said we were going to be on Wednesday of the last Masechta. So we'll say, I just want to show you this just quickly. So if you take a look at the so Amarav Sheishes Harizeh Shchunas Kvaras, the Rosh says Ein L'Tamei Ela Gimel Harishonim Shematza Vein Sarech Livdog Ol. Should I both say this is really very interesting? Just this last piece. If you find 3, the obligation is you have to check 20 amas out. And I will say now the halacha is at that point if you don't find anything additional, you're done. Which I will say also, if you think about it, I just want to end with this. We'll end this. We'll go to the Mishnah tomorrow. It's such an incredible Musar Haskell as well. See, I will say, a person can say, well, 1 second, maybe it's 30 amas, maybe it's 40 amas. You clearly, where there's smoke, there's fire. And I will say, sometimes you should not make bigger things of life in life than what it is. In other words, we often have this problem of kind of creating big problems out of little problems. And sometimes, again, what the Gemara is teaching us is, you have an issue, you dealt with the issue, let it go and move on. Don't keep fanning the flames of controversy, of difficulty. And this is true in our interpersonal relationships. Sometimes, again, there's a small falling out, and a small falling out, you could fan the flames to make something bigger. Sometimes even with our own missteps and mistakes. Sometimes I will say, I fail in a certain area, and I make it into something so much bigger. Instead of just saying, okay, there was a failure, got it, I own it, let me move on. Don't make big problems out of little problems. That's what the Mishnah is saying over here. You found the grave, 3 graves, okay, you got to check 20 amas. You check 20 amas, there's nothing there, case closed. You've discovered a burial chamber of 3 graves, that's it. Move on. We'll also stop over here for today. We'll pick up in Miras Hashem with the new Mishnah tomorrow. Shkoyach. I will say tomorrow, last daf of Maseches Nazir. Incredible. All right, Chevra Zoom, have a great day, everyone.